Hola mi gente, MsMalcolmHughes back with another book review, and today I will be reviewing Punch Me Up to the Gods by Brian Broome. Of all the books that I've read most recently, this book surprised me the most. I had no expectations. I was given an advanced review copy of this book and it blew me away. Let's talk about what it's about. Punch Me Up to the Gods is a memoir. Prior to reading this book, I had no knowledge of Brian Broome. Hopefully it's not Broome, but I had no knowledge of who he was. I knew nothing of his background story, but the description of the book really intrigued me. So I wanted an advanced review copy and I got one. And y'all, oh, let's get into it. So Punch Me Up to the Gods, obviously it's a memoir, so it goes over the life of Brian Broome. He is a homosexual male. That's important. I'm saying that because it's important to the story. All right, I'm gonna read two descriptions of the book. One, a poetic and raw coming-of-age memoir about blackness, masculinity, and addiction. Punch Me Up to the Gods obliterates what we thought were the limitations of not just the American memoir, but the possibilities of the American paragraph. And then here's the other. Punch Me Up to the Gods introduces a powerful new talent in Brian Broome, whose early years growing up in Ohio as a dark-skinned black boy harboring crushes on other boys propel forth this gorgeous, aching, and unforgettable debut. I wanted to read those just so y'all could have a solid footing in what this book is about. As I said, Brian Broome is a homosexual writer who discusses his life growing up in Ohio during the 70s and 80s, knowing that he was homosexual. And oh, what a telling of a story it is. What gets me, y'all know that I love black literature. I love dedications to black literature, whether it is out loud and specific or whether it's just ingrained and you gotta catch it. I love it. Honor us, right? Honor our legacy, honor our heritage. And this book did that. The dedication is a nod to Audre Lorde. It's beautifully done. He acknowledges that he's writing this from a position of the outsiders. He understands that he has always been an outsider. And if you've never read Sister Outsider, go read it. Get your life together. And also Zami. I talked about that. I've reviewed that before. I'll link that above and in the description below. But he understands from a very young age that he is different. In this book, though often hard to read, he is someone who deals with addiction. He deals with internalized hatred. He deals with just self-hate on so many levels. His dark skin, his inability to fit within the black male paradox, his sexuality, right? And it's so painstakingly clear how this destroyed him growing up, trying to come into his own, right? The desire to escape, growing up in a household where you understand that your father and mother may not necessarily have the best chemistry, and then you're in a town in which when the steel mills close, your father is out of a job. Your father has a 6th grade education. Your father doesn't know how to do anything else. This depletes him as a man. He never gets another job. He doesn't seek more work. He goes into a deep depression. Now in retrospect, you can see that your father probably suffers from some of the mental health issues that you deal with, right? But no one knew that at the time. He wasn't diagnosed. It's trauma. That was one thing that I could say over and over again. Trauma. The Meek Mill song, trauma. I always think of that because it's so true. And there was something I posted on my Instagram, so if you don't follow me on Instagram, head over there. But it was one of the quotes, and I want to read it here because it really discusses the hardship sometimes of being black in America. Let's talk about it. Being black in America, right? We're all indoctrinated from birth into the American cultural norm. These American cultural norms are usually white, heteronormative, right? And that's what we see, or we used to, right? Growing up, you saw a lot of that on TV, still to this day, but you saw a lot of that on TV. So even though you culturally that may not be the culture in which you come from, that is what you're striving for, because that is what is presented as the standard of the ideal, right? But what happens when your real life doesn't replicate that, doesn't emulate that, right? That's not what you see. So he really talks a lot about not feeling loved as a child, and we get that. And as an adult, I love that about this book because it connects so many things, and I'll get into it. But a big piece is, here I am as an adult today, reflecting on my childhood, looking back on my experiences, and realizing that from my limited knowledge or from my limited vantage point at that time, I may have missed a lot, right? So even though I grew up feeling maybe not loved, maybe love was there, but I couldn't see it because the markers that I was looking for, right? The markers that I was looking for were not what would have been applicable to my life, right? So he talks about that, and he summarizes it beautifully. So I want to read a short excerpt of that here. It says, feeling loved by Black parents can be tricky. I never felt loved because I was looking for the wrong clues. I was looking for that love that comes from parents who aren't stressed out all the time and trying to make a way out of no way. My mother once told me that when she was a child in the Jim Crow South, a Black parent showing affection toward their children was a surefire way to let white people know what your weakness was. Trauma! Like, just trauma, right? Generations of trauma. There's a book that I started reading, and I haven't finished it, but I will review it on this channel at some point, and it's called It Didn't Start With You, and it talks about generational trauma. Now, a frustration that I have with that book, I haven't finished reading it, so I don't know if it hasn't come up, but I think that oftentimes in America, when we look at generational trauma, people don't want to look at the history of the formerly enslaved, right? You don't want to look at Black people's history. You don't want to talk about the fact that if we're talking about generational trauma, you don't have to look at another country. We have it right here in America, right? We have Black people who are descendants from formerly enslaved Black people, right? And that trauma continues across generations. So let's talk about it, and therefore we can recognize it as being a real thing, a real problem that we're all still suffering from and grappling with. And then we can move forward toward healing, addressing it, all of those things. But I'll get to that when I review that book. But here, this entire work, he does something that I think is brilliant and really freaking hard to do, but he pulls it off. He pulls it off, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm so grateful that he did. Not only is he looking across generations, right? Analyzing his father, himself, his younger self in comparison to his brother, the juxtaposition of like masculinity and the father's expectation. He also at one point has to look at his father's father, right? So just generations and all of the trauma there. But he also does it with a stranger that he sees on the bus. And that's what roots us in this entire story. He sees a young man, initially there at the bus stop. He's a young man with his father. The young man has an accident and is wailing. And his father, instead of comforting him like everyone else at the bus stop, like you have this internal desire to reach for the child, to comfort the child, right? But the father tells him to stop crying. Man up, you be all right. We've all seen this, right? We all know how problematic it is. We've all tried to address it in some form or fashion, but we can visualize it because we've seen it in real life, right? And instantly that roots us in toxic masculinity, or the fact that Black men in general, Black men we're discussing in this story, don't have the opportunity to express a range of emotions, right? Masculinity is limited in the way that it's presented, right? I often, with my friends, they know I often talk about American masculinity and how problematic it is. So that roots everything else. So as he's going back and forth between the telling of his story, he jumps to what he's seeing throughout this entire bus ride, because they do get on the bus, and he watches other moments, how other people interact with a young boy named Twan, how his father interacts with him, what he's observing. And once he's people watching, right? He's watching these individuals, and it all connects because it triggers things for him, and it goes back to his memory. So that's hard to do, to make all of those pieces connect. What takes this to another level of difficulty and success is the fact that, compounded with that, it's him trying to tell us details from the present to the future and the past. And everyone knows when you're writing, if you're having a conversation with your friends, naturally it may flow. You may jump from this time period to this time period, and it just goes. However, when you are trying to do that in writing, it's incredibly challenging, because you have to ensure that your readers can follow you. They won't get lost, that they won't be confounded. And I must say, there were moments when reading this when I would be like, okay, where are we going? But every time, every single time, he had the ability to bring it full circle and make it connect. And oh, how pleasant it was to realize that he could do that. Because as a reader, you have to trust your author, right? You trust the writer to tell you a story, to make it connect, to make it clear. So you go on this journey. And when they do it well, oh my, it's such a thrill. And he did it well. It's trauma, it's heavy. So you may not read it straight through, though you could. I think that it's light enough that you could. But I put it down and I came back to it, and goodness, every time I was so glad that I did. Another piece that it's just the dedication for me. The thread that pulls all of this together as well is the poem by the fantastic poet, the one and only Miss Gwendolyn Brooks. Yes, I'm from Chicago. Okay, at one point in time I lived in Bronzeville. So if you know anything about that history, Gwendolyn Brooks dedicated many poems to that. There's also a podcast, Bronzeville. If you haven't listened to it, please check it out. Just all so brilliant. But Gwendolyn Brooks, she has a poem, We Real Cool. So good. I'm actually going to read it here, for those of you who may not be familiar. The poem goes, well, the title is We Real Cool, the Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. That's the introduction. And the poem goes, we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. And that's the thread for this book. Each line of the poem is broken down and introduces different sections of the book. And this was also well done, because it breaks up his life and tells different events and different stories that match a theme. And I also thought the transitions were so good. I'll give you one transition that I thought was just so good. So it goes from the paragraph to the next header for the next section of the book. So this: I snuggle up close to my suitcase and think about all the times I wandered in the dark trying to find somebody to love me, or at least to take me for the night. And then it goes into we lurk late, right? That transition, so good. Also, not a dedication that he made, but a connection that I made. The raw poetic honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable but good, and you want us to keep going, really reminded me of Roxane Gay. I think she does that so well. I think she's a master at it. And this reminded me of that. Also, someone that he really admires, he talks about in this book, that is a guidepost for all of us who are Black literary folks who love reading and writing, Mr. James Baldwin. I also can see that influence here. He often talks about how James Baldwin is not actually his favorite writer, but he is his hero because he was able to be honest and stand in his truth, and he wishes that he could be that brave. And I want to say to Brian Broome that although that is a desire of yours, I want you to know that with this telling, even though you told a lot, I'm pretty sure you left a lot out, but you are brave. You are brave. You are standing in that. You are telling your truth. And I'm grateful that you did. I really, really, honestly enjoyed reading your memoir. I had no idea who you were before reading this book, but I'm so grateful that you are here. I am so glad that you were able to push through and that you have the opportunity to tell your story. It's so good. So kudos to you. Congratulations. Okay, so not everything's perfect, right? I would say that sometimes reading this book and looking at the internalized self-hatred was hard to read. But it was honest and it was raw and I got it and he knew it, right? The writer understood that looking back, I'm disgusted that this is who I was, that this is how I felt, this is what I knew, this is what I believed. And that's bravery, right? The ability to tell that truth, to honor it. And also it's honestly it's fortunate to be able to have lived through something and to look back and see how much you've grown. Not everyone gets that opportunity. Also, the challenge of going through being a black queer man. He moves from Ohio to Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh to be exact, and how he was looking for an escape, wanted something different. It was different, but a lot of what he thought he was escaping was there as well. And I think we know that about America, right? America is more or less the same everywhere you go. The scenery may be different, but the design is pretty similar. So we get a deep understanding of him grappling with his sexuality, him dealing with addiction, trying to escape it, right? I think all of that is really, really good to read. But something for me that was superbly done was the telling of his mother's story from her perspective. And this brings a bunch of things together too from the black experience. So his mother and him didn't have a great relationship. She knew who he was, you can presume, right? And it was just complicated always. You know, when you're young and if you're a boy, if you want to wear girl clothes or you want to play with what's deemed as like girl toys, you're gonna have some opposition to that. He had a father who beat him for it. He had a mother who begrudgingly allowed it, but it was not without judgment. It was not without resistance, right? So that was all very hard. And that creates for a complicated relationship because she may have felt like she was protecting him. Or we often know that parents have a hard time separating their desire from their children for what the children want for themselves. So, but there's a section when he tells the mother's story from her perspective as a testimonial at church. What? So well done. So well done. We get to hear it from her perspective. It feels raw. It feels honest. It feels transparent. It feels, wow. It feels the way it should have felt. If you've ever gone to a church and had someone go up and give their testimony, right? It's always powerful. And this was powerful. Okay, so the story ends with him actually going to France where Baldwin lived and experiencing that. And he writes a letter to Twan and it all comes together. And it ends, it's not tied up in a bow. It ends in what I've said is a brilliantly beautiful mess of a memoir. This book is a brilliantly beautiful mess of a memoir. Just like life. Just like life. It's so good. It's so good. Y'all, it's so good. If I have to reflect of all of the new books I've read, I dare to say this is the best book I've read all year. Of every book I've read in 2021, this is the best book I've read all year. Of every new book that I've read. Not of any books that I've read, and this is my second time reading it, and I had never done a review. But of every new book I've read this year, like any book I've come on here and reviewed, this is the best book I've read in 2021. Of a book that I've read for the first time. For certain. So, that's it for me. Debut book from the author, and he did that. He did a really fantastic job. And my hope and desire is that all of you will go and read this book, will support it, because it deserves it. It deserves to be read. The story deserves to be told. Whether you are queer identified or not, there is something to be learned. Whether you are black or not, there is something to be, there's knowledge to be gleaned. The human experience and all of us trying to figure out who we are and how do we make it through. And looking back and being grateful for all of it. It's so good. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's so good. It's so worth the read, and I hope that all of you will do that. A read for me, easily an A read. And I dare almost say an A plus. But yeah, I didn't cry. If I would have cried at one point, it would have been an A plus for sure. But definitely an A read. Go check it out. I give it all of its due, and I want to see tons of awards. That's what I want for him. Tons of awards. But that's it for me, y'all. I'm MsMalcolmHughes. More book reviews to come. I'll be finishing up the books that I had for National Poetry Month, which is the poetry reads from April. And then I'm really excited for the books I'll be coming to read and review with you all in June. As always, I'm MsMalcolmHughes, one who believes that books are sometimes better than people. Until next time, stay safe and be kind to each other. If there's a book you want me to read, drop it in the box below. Peace out. Also, for those of you inquiring, I do still have buttons, my Ms. Malcolm Hughes pins, and the details on how to get those are below.